لو سمحت ما تنساش تشترك في القناة ولايك للفيديو وشير علشان تشجعني اقدم لك معرفة اكتر ليك ولغيرك من المشاهدين. شكرا.
Nearly 900 years ago, the Holy Land was home to one of the most extraordinary organizations that has ever existed. The Knights of the Temple of Solomon were elite warriors, unparalleled entrepreneurs, and devoted men of God, ready at any moment to kill and die. They had one mission: to defend the Christian Holy Land. After a severe mauling by the legendary Islamic leader Saladin, the Knights Templar had mobilized their enormous financial resources in Western Europe. Frontline defenses had been reconstructed and garrisoned. But how long could the outnumbered Templars hold out against an enemy that had all the logistical advantages? And just how dangerous were their opponents back in Western Europe, envious of their land and wealth? A knight of the Temple of Solomon, recruited in Europe and sent to the front line in the Holy Land, soon became hardened to the conditions of the East. As monks of the Catholic Church, they were well accustomed to strict discipline, and their every moment, awake and asleep, was regulated. Each day was taken up with prayer, work, and above all, constant training for battle. There was no leisure time, and, in fact, most of the time there was not much battle either. Warfare was expensive in men and horses, and for decades the order had generally pursued a cautious policy in the East. This policy had even included negotiating truces with local Islamic leaders, which made other crusaders deeply uneasy, especially when they negotiated with the leader of a Shiite Muslim sect called the Assassins. The Templars had no qualms in implementing any policy that strengthened their position in the East.
They're not just professional soldiers. The Templars are the professional defenders of the frontier, and that's more than just military. It has to be diplomatic, it has to be political, and so on. So maybe this is why the Templars picked up on the possibility of an alliance with the Assassins more readily than did the secular rulers of the Crusader states.
Pilgrims and crusaders visiting the Holy Land for the first time were often angry to discover that the resident crusaders had negotiated a truce with the Muslim enemy. They had spent a great deal of money to get there and had travelled far. Newly arrived travellers could not believe that any Christians, especially the Templars, even talked to the Muslims.
Fundamentally, they were intolerant on an everyday basis. For much of the time, they had to be tolerant. It's just a matter of common sense and an ability to exist. These people are not stupid. Their beliefs were intolerant, much more intolerant than ours are today. But they were living, as I said, on a frontier. They had to deal with their neighbours. They were not in a position to wage perpetual war. They knew it, their leaders knew it, everybody knew it. So pragmatism, I won't say was the order of the day, but they were perfectly willing and capable of being pragmatic. This does not make them different to other medieval people.
So there were many day-to-day contacts between all the Franks in the East, and some of these are very colourfully described by a Damascene chronicler called Usama ibn Munkid. One of these stories is the most well-known one, about a Frank newly arrived from the West who forces Usama to pray facing east, and one of the Templars intervenes, apologizes to Usama and says, no, this man is a newcomer, he doesn't understand our ways. You can pray in whatever way you wish. And this has sometimes been presented as showing that the Templars were very friendly with the Muslims. But I think it shows much more that in daily life, Templars and other Franks had frequent contact with the Muslims. Many of them spoke Arabic, many more than has been previously said, spoke Arabic, I think. So it was necessary in order to exist to have these daily contacts. But that doesn't necessarily affect their commitment to the Holy War.
Although the Templars had time and time again proved themselves to be dedicated enemies of Islam, there would always be rumours that they fraternized with the enemy. One day, the Templars would actually be accused of secretly being Muslims themselves. By joining the Order of the Temple of Solomon, a knight believed he was purifying himself of the corruption, temptation, and superficialities of the transitory world. As such, he was to lead a hard-working, sober life of sacrifice, dedication, and humility. For humility is the guardian of all virtues, but few people ever saw much humility in the Templars. As individuals, the Templars stood apart with their white robes and red cross. As an organization, the Order of the Temple of Solomon prized its independence. Templar castles ruled their surrounding areas with complete autonomy. They brought little or no interference from the king. The temple often pursued its own strategies, even in direct opposition to the overall Crusader policy. Early in the 13th century, the Christian enclave in the Holy Land stretched from Antioch to Assur, and the Templars now controlled a major proportion of this from their castles at Atlit, Chastelblanc, and in the mountains around Antioch. The undying aim of all the Crusaders remained the capture of Jerusalem for Christianity. The next opportunity arrived with the Fifth Crusade, whose leaders believed that the only way to secure Jerusalem was by first conquering Egypt itself. The Templars joined the Fifth Crusade, whose objective was Egypt's capital, Cairo. The city of Damietta was the first obstacle facing the Crusaders. The Christian siege of Damietta was long and bitter, but finally the Crusaders overwhelmed the Muslims. This so shocked the Sultan of Egypt that he immediately offered to surrender the kingdom of Jerusalem if they would return the captured city and leave. The Christians hesitated. They were expecting reinforcements from Emperor Frederick II, who had vowed to go on crusade. If Frederick's forces arrived in time, Cairo itself would be an attainable goal. While the Christians hesitated, the Muslims prepared their defences. 20 months after the capture of Damietta, the Fifth Crusade finally headed south. The Egyptians easily cut their supply line and flooded the valley. The Christians accepted the Sultan's next offer. They returned Damietta, and he let them escape with their lives. The failure of Emperor Frederick II to arrive in the Holy Land almost certainly resulted in the destruction of the Fifth Crusade.
Frederick eventually went on crusade in 1228, but was forced to turn back because of illness, and the papacy excommunicated him as a result. Frederick wasn't deterred by this. He then set out again, but this very much complicated his relations with the powers that already existed in Cyprus and on the mainland when he arrived there, and it became rather difficult for them to have dealings with him in the long term. Moreover, Frederick expected his own will to be obeyed. He had a quasi-absolutist regime in the Kingdom of Sicily, which was one of the important parts of his empire, and he found it difficult to deal with military orders, accustomed to being at least semi-independent, and a Jerusalem baronage, which had a very highly developed sense of its legal rights. So from the very beginning, Frederick was in conflict with important powers in the East, and this included the Templars.
As an order of the Catholic Church, the Templars were not supposed to have dealings with the excommunicated Frederick, but their conflict with the German Emperor had begun much earlier. Back in Europe, Frederick had angrily complained that the Templar network had purchased so much of his lands in Italy that it was trying to control his entire kingdom. After quarrelling with the Crusaders in the east, Frederick II headed down the coast and actually met with the Sultan of Egypt. At the city of Jaffa, he signed a sensational treaty. The Egyptians voluntarily ceded back part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the Holy City itself, to the Christians. Almost single-handedly and without bloodshed, the excommunicate German Emperor had finally recovered Jerusalem for Christianity. Frederick then went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and had himself crowned. The Christians resident in the West, especially the Templars, were not impressed with Frederick's achievement, as one of the clauses of the treaty prevented the repair of any fortifications in and around the Holy City.
There does seem thereafter to have been a period of enmity between the military orders, particularly between Frederick II and the Templars, which resulted in a number of confiscations of Templar lands in Frederick's lands in Italy when he returned to the West in 1229. One of the consequences of the enmity between Frederick and the Templars was the Templars' refusal to accept the treaties that Frederick had signed. And indeed there are some sources that claim, I think wrongly, but claim that there was a plot to murder Frederick and that the Templars were involved in that plot.
His approach was one of attempted coexistence on what we believe to have been a long-term basis. He was trying to achieve peace in a true sense of it, whereas what the Templars had done in the past in terms of coexistence was temporary. They were making sort of strategic truces and so on. So their approach was fundamentally different.
Frederick's negotiation with the Egyptian had greatly increased the Crusaders' territory in the Holy Land. Over the next few years, further crusades by Theobald of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall used both military action and negotiation to increase the Christian state to the largest it had been for 50 years. Despite the apparent success of the Crusader state, the Knights Templar still refused to acknowledge Frederick's treaty with the Sultan of Egypt, and they steadfastly pursued their own policies. The Templars opened negotiation with Egypt's rival, the Sultan of Damascus. The Templars believed the Egyptian empire was growing weak, a situation they felt the Crusaders should be exploiting to the full.
The fact is that the Muslim states of that region had other and far more important things to worry about. Most obviously the Mongols, who, unlike the Crusaders, did pose a mortal threat. Certainly were perceived as posing a mortal threat to the Muslim world, to the whole civilization of Islam. It was on an entirely different level, even compared with the First Crusade.
The Mongol Empire, created by Genghis Khan, had expanded across half a continent and now threatened the Islamic and Christian states. Fleeing the Mongol horde was an army called the Khwarizm, who also posed a grave threat to the Christian state. The westernmost Islamic leader, the Sultan of Damascus, felt most threatened, and he had accepted a non-aggression treaty with the Templars in which he gave them back their old castle of Safad. The Sultan of Egypt was stunned and immediately allied himself with the Khwarizm. The Crusader state was surrounded. The Khwarizm struck first, invading Palestine and attacking Damascus. The Christians assembled the largest force they could, and together with the Sultan of Damascus took the field at La Fourbi. Their Muslim allies deserted, and the Egyptians crushed the Christians in one of the most devastating battles of the century. "90% of the Templar force in the Holy Land had been killed at the Battle of La Fourbi. But many Christians, especially Frederick II, squarely blamed the Knights Templar for the catastrophe. The crisis deepened over the next few years as the weakened Crusader state lost some of its most powerful castles. Frederick accused the Templars of perpetuating war for their own ends. He claimed that the military order could not exist in peace, and that's why they had sabotaged his treaty with the Egyptians. Frederick was not the first to accuse the Knights Templar of warmongering, and he would not be the last. The King of France, Louis IX, was the first to respond to the Crusaders' frantic pleas for help. Louis arrived in the East in 1248 with a diverse contingent of European knights. Louis decided to follow the strategy of previous crusades, attempting to knock out Egypt before taking Jerusalem.
Unfortunately, it's very difficult to attack Egypt because of the Nile, because of the series of canals that crisscrossed the various branches of the Nile, and one couldn't necessarily move one's army across these branches all in one go. And there was one very important incident when the Templars, together with the Earl of Salisbury and Robert of Artois, who was a younger brother of King Louis IX of France, had already crossed one branch of the Nile and were opposite the Egyptian town of Mansoura. Robert of Artois, keen to gain glory, wanted to attack Mansoura. It would appear that the Templars wished to adopt their usual rather cautious policy and wait for the rest of the army. But when Robert of Artois insisted, using, as one chronicler said, foul and abusive words that were characteristic of the French, the Templars agreed to go along with this. But it proved to be a disaster because Mansoura was a town with small, tight streets, quite inappropriate for a mounted attack of the sort that the Count of Artois and the Templars were forced to make. And many of them were trapped in these narrow streets and were killed. So by the time the bulk of the army appeared, this had turned from what was planned to be a glorious attack into a rout.
The disaster of Mansourah had seen the entire vanguard of the Crusader army eliminated. Whatever the motivation for the Templar assault on Montserrat, the Templars had found themselves central to yet another catastrophe. They had lost 200 knights, and another Grand Master had been killed in battle. The retreating Christians were eventually surrounded, and Louis IX, the King of France, surrendered to the Egyptian Sultan. He was put up for an enormous ransom of 400,000 livres de Tours, at a time when the annual income of the entire Kingdom of France was 250,000 livres. Templar treasure ships waiting offshore were targeted by the king's entourage, but the Templars refused to release the money, as much of it had been deposited with them for safekeeping by other crusaders.
In fact, there wasn't any obvious conflict. A member of the king's entourage broke the locks of some of these trunks of money in the presence of the Templars, who made a symbolic objection. In that way, the Templars managed to maintain their integrity while still making a contribution towards the king's ransom.
Immediately on his release, Louis went to the Crusader city of Acre, where he remained for 4 years. Despite the Templars' support for the French king, they would not abandon their own policies in the Holy Land. While Louis hoped to make peace with Egypt, he caught the Templars negotiating once more with the Muslim city of Damascus. Louis was shocked and forced the Templars to submit and repent. When Louis IX eventually sailed for home, the Christian Holy Land lost not just his substantial resources, but also one of the few leaders who could unify the state and keep the Templars in line. Not long after, the Crusaders' situation took a turn for the worse. The Mongols were on the move again, and Egypt had undergone a coup, and a new power, the Mamluks, began carving an empire for itself. The Mamluks recognized the Mongols to be a far greater threat than the Christians. By the year 1260, the Mongols had sacked Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus, leaving no Islamic power east of the Christians. The ever-diminishing sliver of the Christian Holy Land stood between the world's two most powerful armies. Incredibly, the Crusaders allowed the Muslims to pass through their land en route to the Mongol hordes. At the Battle of Ain Jalut, it was the Mamluks who were victorious, inflicting the first major defeat on the Mongol Empire. The Crusader leaders quickly made peace with the victorious Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, but the Templars and the Hospitallers refused to hand over their lucrative Muslim prisoners of war. The Mamluks immediately retaliated. The Mamluk advance was slow but methodical and relentless.
The last campaigns of the crusading epic in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, are campaigns of siege warfare. The Crusaders are in their castles, in their fortified cities. In fact, essentially in their fortified cities. We can almost forget the castles of this last few decades. And the Muslim armies are seeking to take these powerfully defended, strongly walled, fortified cities and a few castles. Siege warfare is slow. It's before gunpowder, of course. So even though the Muslim armies were extremely sophisticated in this kind of warfare, it was a slow process.
In the early 1260s, the Mamluk concentrated on the southern Christian lands. In the late 1260s, they took Antioch and the Templars abandoned the enclave. In the 1270s, the Tripoli enclave crumbled. Only the arrival of Prince Edward of England, the future Edward I, with 10,000 Mongol allies, enabled a decade-long truce. But before the truce was up, the Mamluks decided to finish the Christians once and for all. In 1290, the Mamluks assembled 60,000 cavalry, 160,000 infantry, and 100 mangonel siege engines around the Christian capital of Acre. The temple compound was the last building to fall, and the Grand Master and all the remaining Templars were killed in the fighting. On August 14th, 1291, the Knights Templars evacuated their last standing castle at Atlid and set up their new headquarters on Cyprus. The Templar castle of Atlid was the greatest they had ever built and had never been taken by siege. The Mamluks demolished it, so it could never again be used against the forces of Islam. The destruction of the last Crusader stronghold on the Holy Land was proof to many in the West that God no longer approved of such violence.
By the 13th century, the crusading ideal was recognized as something of a dream, an impossible dream. There were many who liked the idea as a sort of romantic, epic, heroic, religious concept. But as far as large numbers of the knightly elite, the educated classes and the rising bourgeoisie of the towns wanting to make sacrifices for this, the idea had become impractical. So I think it would be quite fair to say that the Templars and the other crusading orders were left high and dry.
The Knights Templar were now more vulnerable than they could possibly imagine. Their entire reason for being was the defense of the Holy Land, and they had failed. But the Templars were still an order of the Catholic Church. Any move against the Templars would be a direct assault on the papacy itself. While the Order of the Temple mustered its forces once more for yet another crusade against the Muslims, storm clouds were gathering back in Europe. The Order of the Temple of Solomon was about to find itself caught in the middle of a cataclysmic power struggle that would shake Western Europe to the very core. The triumph of Islam over the Christians in the Holy Land was a blow to Western European prestige, but not a total catastrophe. Enthusiasm for major crusades had declined over the last century, as the Christians had suffered defeat after defeat. To many, there must have been some reason why God had seemingly abandoned the Crusaders. The sins of pride, arrogance, and avarice were accusations the Templars had faced many times, but the Templars had never once given up the fight against the Muslims. The Grand Master himself had died in their last battle at Acre, and the remaining Templars had all fought to the death. For the order as a whole, the annihilation of the Christian state was merely a temporary setback.
The Templars fought very gallantly to defend Acre in 1291, and even though they were driven back on Cyprus in the course of the 1290s, there's plenty of evidence to show that they were continuing to maintain the cause of the Crusade. They hired fleets, they attacked the Egyptian and Syrian mainlands, they attempted to establish a base on the island of Ruad off Tortosa. It was unsuccessful, but the will was there to do it.
Neither did the Templars halt their recruiting and fundraising activities. Crusading enthusiasm had dampened in Europe, but had by no means died. The Templars had no difficulty attracting new recruits.
An individual's motivation for joining one of the military orders, I am quite sure, was almost entirely religious. So if he succeeded in saving his soul, then from his point of view, he was victorious. The fact that he had lost a battle, lost a fight, that the Crusader states had fallen was, I won't say secondary, it was a disaster. But as far as the individual motivation of a recruit is concerned, if he fought and died in the cause that he believed in and went to heaven, then he, as an individual, was victorious.
With a new headquarters in Cyprus, new recruits, a highly productive network still providing immense funds, the Order of the Temple continued its 200-year-old struggle against Islam. After each catastrophe, the resilient Templars had always regrouped and returned to the fray.
In the early hours of October the 13th, 1307, the officials of Philip the Fair, the King of France, suddenly arrested the Templars in the lands which the king controlled and charged them with a variety of heretical crimes, of obscenities, of the worship of an idol, and very quickly extracted confessions from many of the Templars that had been arrested at that time.
The charges brought against the Templars could not possibly be more serious. They included treason with the Muslims, worshipping an idol, denying Jesus Christ, spitting on the cross, sleeping with the devil, eating the ashes of their dead, impregnating virgins, and various homosexual activities. If the Templar Knights were found guilty of any one of these crimes, they would be burned alive. More than 5,000 Templars throughout France had been arrested in a highly coordinated dawn swoop. Even the Grand Master of the Order of the Temple, James of Malay, had been captured, and he too had confessed to many of the accusations. Could one of the most respected orders of the Church really have been a secret society of devil worshippers? At the same time as the arrest, Philip, the King of France, had seized all the Templar lands and properties and urged the crown heads of Europe to do the same. But not all of them were convinced of the Templars' guilt.
Those rulers who were not linked to the French monarchy were very, very sceptical, as were many independent commentators. The Italians in particular, who wrote about it at the time, were quite convinced there was a financial motive behind it. And we have to take their view seriously. Nobody knew more about money than the Italians in the early 14th century. So there was widespread scepticism. Edward II of England, for instance, said that he simply did not believe it, that these had been gallant defenders of the Holy Land and important servants of the English crown, and that he found the whole thing impossible to believe and quite astounding.
It was well known that the French crown was in severe financial difficulties. In the preceding years, the king had debased the coinage, expelled the Lombard bankers, and confiscated all properties of the Jews. Philip was exceptionally pious and probably even believed the accusations brought against the Templars. If they were true, it was his duty to purify his realm. The arrest of the Templars, however, was a long-awaited opportunity for the king to assert his dominance over an increasingly weak papacy.
One notable aspect of the trial is that the reigning Pope, Clement V, wasn't told in advance, so it came as much as a surprise to him as it did to the Templars, and he was very affronted by it. He was perhaps less concerned about the fate of the Templars than he was about his own authority, I think, and therefore, having seen that the event had occurred, he was most interested in reasserting his own position vis-à-vis a powerful secular monarch like Philip IV. So he actually tried to take over the trial, having found that he couldn't really reverse it. And this is the reason that the trial spread to other countries, because the Pope ordered a general arrest of the Templars in other countries in order to try to find the truth of the charges that were brought against the order.
The intervention of the Pope was what the Templars had been waiting for. All immediately withdrew their damning confessions, as it was a custom of the time for an accused man to confess and later retract when he was back on safe ground. But the Templars were blind to the political realities. Europe was seeing a massive power struggle, nothing less than the birth of a nation-state, as the King of France attempted to limit the centuries-old political influence of the Church in France. Nothing would stand in his way. King Philip was set on destroying the Templars and had launched an enormous public relations offensive, circulating the sensational confessions throughout his kingdom. To the people of medieval France and Europe, news of the blasphemous Templar confessions was profoundly shocking. Even today, many people still believe that these confessions must have contained at least a grain of truth.
Some historians have actually believed that the Templars were guilty of the crimes of which they were accused, and they point to the large number of confessions that were made, and indeed the great detail that one can see in the confessions of participation in obscene and blasphemous rites, which the Templars were accused of. I think, though, for those of us looking back on the 20th century, a century scarred by governmental pressures, both mental and physical, in particular, a century in which torture has been used extensively by most of the governments of the world, we, I think, can have a good deal less faith in confessions extracted under that kind of pressure. And indeed, most of these Templars were tortured in all kinds of horrendous and painful ways. And not one of us could say that we wouldn't be forced to confess almost anything, perhaps anything, if we were put under sufficient pressure.
The confessions were damning evidence enough, but following 2 centuries of suspicion and rumour, they found fertile ground in the minds of many Europeans. The Templars' vast wealth, their failure to defend the Holy Land, their unusual relationship with the Muslims and Islamic culture was enough to convince the Pope that there may be some truth in the allegations. But more importantly for the papacy, its own prestige was at stake. The Pope had seen no option but to abandon the Order of the Temple. The Templars had few among their ranks who were capable of defending themselves against such abominable charges.
The fact that the Templars regarded themselves and were regarded by others as unqualified in strictly religious or doctrinal matters was not a problem in the early years, but I suspect that it laid them open to criticism later, or at least was like a chink in their armour. The fact that they had always claimed not to be scholarly in religious matters meant that they could be accused of deviant religious beliefs or activities. And they would find it very, very difficult to justify themselves or to explain this, because in the past they had never claimed any knowledge. So, in a sense, their only excuse was ignorance.
The trial of the Templars took 5 years. Midway through, the King of France had 54 Templars burned as relapsed heretics, quickly ending a brief but spirited Templar defense.
لو سمحت ما تنساش تشترك في القناة ولايك للفيديو وشير علشان تشجعني أقدم لك معرفة أكتر ليك ولغيرك من المشاهدين. شكرا.
Finally, in March 1312, 5 years after the arrest, the Pope announced the abolition of the Order of the Temple of Solomon. All of their vast lands and treasure were handed over to the Knights Hospitaller, much to the fury of the French king. Philip immediately sued the Hospitallers for the legal costs of the trial. All of Europe was stunned. The abolition of the Templars was unprecedented. Many still refused to believe the Templars' guilt, but Europe's crowns could not resist the rich pickings of the Templar properties.
In England, for instance, Edward II took over the Templar lands and the Templar treasury, and he made assignments on these lands and on this money. And although in the long term, once the Templars were suppressed in 1312, the property was transferred to the Hospitallers. We know from Hospitaller records that the Order of the Hospitaller was still trying to get hold of lands that Edward II had assigned to political friends and political favourites of his in the late 1330s. We know from Hospitaller inventories that that's the case. So once the process had started, it was equally damaging to the Temple in those countries where the monarchs had, in the first place, been quite sceptical of their guilt.
In the year 1314, the two most senior Templars, the last Grand Master James of Malay and Geoffrey of Charnay, were burned alive as relapsed heretics. Ordinary knights who confessed and repented were given prison sentences and were then allowed to join other orders. Over nearly 200 years of warfare, 20,000 knights had died fighting Islam, but in the end, it was Christianity itself that destroyed the Order of the Temple of Solomon. Today, little remains of the Order's empire. Ruins of enormous castles, a few remnants of the vast European network, which once owned more than 900 preceptories. However, modern warfare, trading, shipping, communications, banking, and farming all owe something to the innovations of the Knights Templar.
The history of the Templars taken overall is a very neat story of rise and fall, of initial popularity, of initial humility, which turned into overweening power, arrogance and avarice, ultimately leading to their trial. In fact, I don't think that that is a very good way of looking at their history. I think that we are far too much influenced by the fact they were brought to trial. all the time, therefore, if one's trying to examine the history of the Templars in the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, one must try to do it without bearing in mind the trial that occurred, to try to think as if the trial never happened, and then look at the history of the Templars. And I think one would find it would look rather different, because in my view, the trial was not a direct consequence of any actions or omissions that could be laid at the Templars' door in the period from the 1290s onwards. I think that the action against the Templars in the trial was largely generated by circumstances within France, and in particular circumstances within the Capetian government at that particular time.
The story of the Knights Templar does not end with the destruction of the order and the immolation of James of Molay and Geoffrey of Charnay. The dramatic rise and fall of one of the most powerful institutions of the day has fascinated people for the last 7 centuries.
The fact that they were brought to trial in 1307 and eventually suppressed in 1312 inevitably colours the way that we look at them. And then in turn, the way that they've been written about, in particular I think by Sir Walter Scott in the novel Ivanhoe, which was published in 1819, has helped to reinforce the idea of the arrogant, overconfident, overbearing Templar who was nevertheless also the possessor of mysterious, esoteric, anti-Christian secrets.
Soon after the abolition of the Knights Templar, legends grew up of escaped Templars, secret societies, hidden treasure, mysterious scrolls, and strange connections to some of the world's greatest religious icons.
One of the reasons, I think, for the continuing fascination with the Templars is that they have a long after history, which begins almost immediately with the burning of James of Molay and Geoffrey of Charnay in Paris as relapsed heretics in 1314. Various chroniclers claimed that Molay had brought a curse down upon the Capetian house, and in particular upon Philip the Fair, as well as upon Clement V, calling upon the vengeance of God to bring them before the tribunal of heaven within the year. And of course it was easy for them to say this because both Philip died within the year, so one could make it look as if that really did make sense. But those dramatic ideas that one sees in near contemporary chronicles have since been embroidered and developed by other people seeking sensationalism, seeking a story that continues after the Templar sensational end. In my view, there's no substance in any of these stories, but that doesn't stop them being used by different people in different periods for their own purposes, and this continues right down to the present day.
One of the most persistent legends associated with the Templars is their connection with the Shroud of Turin, which for many years was believed to have been the burial shroud of Jesus Christ.
In the 1970s and 1980s, when historians and scientists were arguing about the authenticity of this particular relic, they needed to provide it, if it was to be seen as authentic, they needed to provide it with a scientific provenance, but they also needed to provide it with a continuous history. And there were really large gaps. One of those gaps was filled, in some people's view, by the idea that it was the Templars who'd held the Turin Shroud, that they'd seized it during the Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople in 1204, that they'd kept it secret among their treasures throughout the 13th century, that was the origin of the accusation that they worshipped idols, that they'd made many copies of it, and it had been the subject of a cult within the order, and that before the Templars were finally suppressed, they had managed to smuggle it away into the possession of the Charnay family, who are the ones who exhibit it in the late 14th century, when it seems to reappear again. So this seemed like a plausible theory as to what had happened to the shroud in the 13th and the 14th centuries, while also rather neatly explaining the accusation of idol worship against the Templars. The problem with the theory is that there's not one shred of evidence to support it. It is entirely a theory, and it's totally incredible and quite unbelievable.
The legend of the Order of the Temple of Solomon lives on through the activities of thousands of modern Templar societies all over the world. Many have charitable aims, and some claim an unbroken link to the last Templars. But it is the Order's role in the Freemasonry movement that has done most to give the Templars worldwide recognition.
I don't think that for the rest of the medieval period, and really very much into the 16th and 17th centuries, there's massive interest in the Templars. Where it really revives is in the 18th century, with the growth of Masonic orders, who liked to believe that they were directly linked to the Temple of Solomon and to the Masons who had supposedly built the Temple of Solomon. And in this sense, they looked towards a provenance associated with institutions that had lived in those buildings on the Temple Mount, which the Crusaders had thought had actually been the Temple of Solomon. And of course, they lighted upon the Templars as part of that early history. Given that these Masonic orders also sought a provenance for themselves, as most new institutions do, it seemed logical to see the Templars as being part of that system of esoteric ideas and secret ideas which they liked to believe that they were guardians of, and which they might have believed were suppressed by the regime of Philip the Fair and the papal monarchy as represented by Clement V. So I think that the real revival in Templar interest comes as a consequence of the Masons, particularly the German Masons, from about the 1760s onwards.
Many of the Templar legends begin with the Order's occupation of the Temple platform in Jerusalem. And some people believe the Templar Knights must have excavated beneath the platform. Here the Templars are supposed to have found at one time or another not just the esoteric secrets of King Solomon himself, but even the Ark of the Covenant. But there are several problems with these theories.
The Crusaders actually called it Solomon's Stable. And really, although this name has no base from architecture or historical point of view, because that site, as it is stand today, has nothing to do with Prophet Solomon's. We know that Solomon's developed Jerusalem, but not that site or that area exactly. Although the structure as it is stand today, especially the bases, are Roman, while the upper courses is purely Islamic and from the Umayyad dynasty.
One Templar legend is that their vast treasure, together with any esoteric secrets they may or may not have discovered, escaped the clutches of the French king. For decades, the discovery of the lost Templar gold and the lost secrets have been the ambition of many a treasure seeker. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, which is the heart of Scottish Freemasonry, is also believed by many to hold those Templar treasures which must have eluded the King of France.
When the Templars were arrested in 1307, the officials of Philip the Fair very carefully inventoried all their possessions, and they also took over the Temple fortress and bank to the north of Paris. So it seems very unlikely that any substantial part of the Templar possessions was missed by these people. I don't think there's any secret treasure. I think it's much more mundane and straightforward than that. I think simply that the officials of Philip the Fair took over the Templar possessions that they could lay their hands on, which was most of what the Templars possessed in France.
The legend of the Knights Templar expands every year as new theories are published, each seeking to prove conclusively that the Templars really are connected to history's most famous names and places. At one time or another, the Templars have been associated with not just the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail, but even the discovery of America a century before Columbus.